A poor 14-year-old black boy saved a billionaire's life mid-flight, but what he said while the billionaire lay in shock stunned everyone on board. What happens next will leave you speechless. A billionaire gasped for breath mid-flight, panic filling the cabin. Then, a poor 14-year-old black boy stepped forward unafraid. Subscribe if you believe heroes can come from anywhere. The boarding gate doors closed with a heavy hiss, and Malik Dorsey stepped onto the plane with his thin backpack clutched tightly against his chest. The air inside the cabin was cooler than the humid terminal he had left behind, carrying with it the sterile scent of recirculated air and faint traces of coffee. The boy's heart hammered as he shuffled forward, trying not to bump into the line of passengers dragging rolling suitcases. His sneakers, their soles nearly worn smooth, squeaked faintly on the carpeted aisle, each step reminding him that he was far from home. Malik tried to keep his head up, but the sheer size of the cabin, the wide rows, gleaming overhead compartments, and hushed murmurs of strangers speaking in clipped tones made him feel small and out of place. A flight attendant, tall and dressed crisply in navy blue, glanced at his boarding pass, then smiled politely. "Straight down this way, seat 34B," the man instructed. Malik nodded quickly, his voice caught in his throat and edged forward, his gaze darting around to take in every detail. The first rows he passed looked nothing like the plane rides he had imagined from pictures and magazines. Wide leather seats stretched comfortably across the aisle. Small lamps glowed at each armrest, and glasses of sparkling water sat already half-finished on tray tables. Men in sharp suits and heavy watches leaned back casually, as if this luxury was the most natural thing in the world. Malik slowed just for a moment, staring, his breath caught in wonder. That was when his eyes met another's. A man seated by the window in the front row turned his head slowly, almost reluctantly. His hair, streaked with silver, was combed back with precise care, and his tailored suit clung to his shoulders like armor. His face was lean, the skin pale beneath the dim lights, and his gaze carried an intensity Malik could not explain. The boy froze, his chest tightening. For a single second, the hum of the plane seemed to fade, leaving only the sharp silence of two worlds colliding. Malik felt both invisible and seen at once, a boy in hand-me-down clothes staring at a figure whose very presence demanded respect. The man did not speak, did not even nod. His expression was unreadable, neither welcoming nor dismissive, but behind his eyes lay a weight that felt almost like sorrow. Malik's breath hitched, but the line of the passengers pushed him forward, breaking the silent connection. He stumbled ahead, gripping his backpack straps tighter, his palms damp. By the time he reached the narrower rows of economy, the glamour of the first-class cabin seemed like a distant dream. Malik squeezed into his middle seat between two strangers, both of whom avoided his eyes. He slid his backpack carefully under the seat in front of him, resting one hand on it as though guarding treasure. The worn zipper had been repaired twice, and the bag contained all he owned for the trip. A second pair of clothes, his scholarship papers, and a battered notebook filled with scribbles of human anatomy diagrams he had copied from the library. He drew a slow breath, trying to settle his nerves, but the thought of the man in first class clung to him. Who was he, and why did he look so hollow, as though the success surrounding him was a burden rather than a crown? The engines began to rumble, a deep vibration that climbed through the cabin floor into Malik's bones. Passengers shifted in their seats, fastening belts, whispering to one another, their voices muffled beneath the announcements from the overhead speaker. Malik pressed his forehead lightly against the cool window, watching the runway lights blur as the plane began to move. His thoughts returned to his father back home, working another long night at the factory, his hands scarred from machinery, his shoulders bent with fatigue. Malik's chest tightened with both pride and guilt. He knew how hard his father had fought to raise him, and he carried that weight into the sky. The boy closed his eyes briefly, recalling the day that had planted his dream. The image of a volunteer medic kneeling over a collapsed man at a community event, moving with confidence, saving a life with steady hands and calm words. Malik had stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, heart pounding, and something had taken root in him that day. He wanted to learn how to do that, to fight for breath where it faltered, to hold life steady when it slipped. But how could a boy who struggled even to afford shoes dream of becoming a doctor? The thought made his throat tighten, but then he touched the edge of his scholarship letter tucked into his notebook. The church had believed in him, given him this chance to study abroad, and he swore he would not waste it. Even so, doubt crept in like a shadow. Would he belong among strangers in foreign cities, among boys with money and tutors? Or would he always feel like he did now, a stowaway in a world not meant for him? The plane roared, lifting from the ground, and Malik's stomach dropped as the city lights fell away beneath the wings. He clutched the armrests, his knuckles white, while the man beside him muttered impatiently about the turbulence. Malik whispered under his breath, "Please, let me make it through this. Let me prove I belong." As the plane steadied at 30,000 feet, Malik leaned back, eyes still wide, his body buzzing with both fear and determination. He could not shake the memory of the man in first class. That hollow stare locked on him for only a heartbeat. Something in it had unsettled him deeply, as if their lives, so far apart in wealth and circumstance, were already entwined by a thread neither of them could see. He exhaled slowly, unaware of the storm waiting ahead, unaware that his courage would soon be tested in ways no scholarship could prepare him for. All he knew, in that fragile moment of hope and fear, was that his journey had begun. The boy who had nothing was about to meet the man who had everything. The glass of water trembled slightly in his hand, the thin rim catching a shard of light as the aircraft began its steady climb. Damian Vaylor, whose signature once toppled entire corporations, now sat motionless in his wide leather seat, his jaw set hard against an invisible weight pressing on his chest. Around him, first class exuded quiet luxury, the soft glow of overhead lamps, the muted clink of cutlery, the perfume of imported leather and polished oak. Yet Damian was not reading the market brief neatly folded beside him, nor was he dictating orders into the phone clasped in his aide's nervous fingers. His gaze remained locked on the clouds drifting like pale ghosts beyond the oval window, his reflection staring back at him with eyes as hollow as the sky itself. The billionaire's empire stretched across oceans, his ships cutting through waters where his competitors drowned, his steel mills roaring while others fell silent. But here, 30,000 feet above the world he controlled, there was no boardroom, no balance sheet, only the dull, nagging reminder in his chest of a fragile heart that ignored wealth and power. His doctor's voice echoed in his mind, stern but futile. "You should not travel, Damian. One attack in the air, and there may be no one to save you." He had waved the warning aside. Business could not wait. Reputation could not bend. Now, with every beat of his heart, the man who once appeared untouchable felt the walls of mortality creeping closer. Across the aisle, his assistant Elias Cray shifted uncomfortably. He was a tall, wiry man whose loyalty had never faltered, but in moments like this he struggled to know whether to speak or remain silent. Damian's shoulders were rigid, his hand resting lightly near the concealed vial of pills tucked into his jacket. Elias's eyes flickered to it, then back to his employer's face, reading the faint pallor that had grown sharper since takeoff. "Sir," Elias ventured cautiously, his voice low so the other passengers would not hear, "perhaps you should rest." Damian turned his head slowly, his gaze cool enough to silence an entire boardroom. "I'll rest when we land," he replied, his voice rough like steel grinding against stone. His hand tightened briefly on the armrest, betraying what his words would not. Elias nodded and retreated into silence, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed his unease. At that moment, the cabin curtain shifted, and a line of economy passengers filed past toward their cramped seats in the rear. Among them was a boy with worn sneakers, clutching a backpack so tightly it seemed to hold his entire world. Malik Dorsey's eyes, wide with a mix of nervousness and excitement, lifted instinctively as he passed. For the briefest second, they met Damian's. The exchange was fleeting but charged. Malik's gaze held no fear, no greed, only the bright hunger of someone who wanted life itself. Damian, by contrast, carried the weariness of a man who had seen too much of it. For that heartbeat in time, the billionaire felt something stir, an almost forgotten memory of youth, before ambition and empire drowned him in numbers and negotiations. His lips parted as though to speak, but the boy was already guided further down the aisle by the steward, disappearing into the narrow rows of economy where voices overlapped and space was rationed like currency. Damian exhaled, leaning back into his seat. The moment unsettled him, though he could not explain why. "Strange," he muttered under his breath, his eyes still fixed on the aisle where the boy had vanished. Elias glanced at him. "Something wrong, sir?" Damian shook his head faintly, his face hardening again into its mask of indifference. Nothing. Just turbulence, he said, though the air outside was calm. The engines hummed, steady and relentless, carrying the passengers deeper into the sky. Yet in the quiet of first class, a subtle current of tension remained. Damien's fingers drummed once against the armrest, a small, unconscious rhythm marking the unease in his chest. Beyond the curtain, Malik settled into his seat, unaware that the brief crossing of eyes had already written the prologue of a story neither of them could escape. Damien turned once more to the window, but his reflection seemed different now, less untouchable, more human, shadowed by the faintest trace of fear. He closed his eyes, forcing the thought aside, his pride refusing to yield even here. Still, a question lingered in his mind, quiet but insistent. What if the doctor had been right? The silence of the cabin deepened, pressing in like the clouds outside. Neither man understood the threads tightening invisibly between them, nor how fragile the boundary was between power and helplessness, between wealth and survival. For now, all that remained was the faint echo of that glance, an unspoken recognition bridging worlds apart. Neither understood that their paths were already bound together by fate. Two lives, separated by wealth, would soon collide at 30,000 feet. The tray clattered to the floor, its contents scattering like coins across the polished aisle as the aircraft shook with a sudden jolt of turbulence. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Overhead bins rattled, and passengers clutched their armrests as the hum of the engines deepened into a roar. In the midst of the commotion, Damien Vaylor's hand pressed tightly against his chest. His sharp, commanding posture crumbled in an instant. His face drained of color, and beads of sweat gathered across his brow. His breathing grew shallow, a strained rasp tearing at his throat. For a man known for towering over boardrooms, he now seemed frighteningly small, a titan diminished in seconds. Then, without warning, he slumped sideways in his leather seat, the weight of his body knocking over the tray table with a hollow snap. The first-class cabin erupted in shock. Passengers cried out, and a steward dropped the glass he had been holding, the sound shattering against the floor. A crewman rushed forward, his face pale with panic. "Sir! Sir, can you hear me?" His voice trembled, betraying more fear than control. The crew had trained for emergencies, for sudden turbulence, for fainting passengers, but not for this, not for a billionaire collapsing mid-flight. Every second that ticked by seemed to swell with dread. From behind the thin curtain that divided economy from the polished world of first class, Malik Dorsey's eyes widened. He leaned forward instinctively, his worn backpack clutched against his chest like it might shield him from what he saw. His heart raced as recognition flooded through him, not of the man, but of the moment. The billionaire's body jerking, the crew scrambling, the suffocating fear of helplessness, it all mirrored the day he had once stood frozen on a cracked sidewalk, watching a medic kneel over a man whose life was slipping away. That same feeling of urgency now gripped him, stronger than the seatbelt across his lap. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. Around him, the strangers seated on either side shifted uncomfortably, craning their necks toward the curtain. One muttered, "What's happening up there?" while another shook his head, whispering, "It doesn't look good." Their words stabbed Malik like tiny needles. He could almost hear the medic's voice from years ago, echoing in memory. "Count steady. Don't panic. Every second matters." The steward's desperate voice broke through again, louder this time. "We need help. Is there a doctor on board?" His plea carried through the cabin, trembling with urgency, but the silence that followed was heavier than steel. Men and women exchanged nervous looks, hoping someone else would rise, someone with authority, someone with knowledge. But no one moved. Malik gripped the armrest, his knuckles white, his thoughts a storm. He was only 14, no doctor, no hero, just a boy from Glenford with shoes worn thin and dreams too big for his pocket. Yet as Damien's head tilted lifelessly to the side, his lips parting in shallow, broken gasps, Malik's chest tightened with a clarity that cut through his fear. He could not sit there. He could not do nothing. His legs trembled as he leaned forward, eyes locked on the curtain that seemed both impossibly thin and impossibly heavy. He whispered to himself, barely audible over the drone of the engines. "Do something." The words burned in his chest, pushing him forward like a force stronger than reason. The crew scrambled with the medical kit, fumbling with latex gloves and oxygen tubes, their movements sharp but unfocused. One passenger shouted, "Hurry up!" Another muttered, "This is insane. We're in the sky, and he's dying." Fear thickened the air, heavy and suffocating. Malik's breathing grew uneven as he shifted in his seat. He could feel the judgment already if he stood. What would they say? That a poor boy thought he could save a man worth billions? That his hands, scarred from carrying groceries and books, could do the work of surgeons and doctors? Yet beneath the weight of those doubts, another thought struck him harder. What if no one else tried? The steward pressed fingers against Damien's throat, his expression grim. "I can't find a pulse," he shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. Passengers gasped, some covering their mouths, others whispering prayers. Malik's heart hammered as he rose slightly, his knees brushing the back of the seat in front of him. His mind flashed to the medic again, the rhythm of compressions, the steady count, the unwavering focus. He could almost feel that memory guiding his body now. His breath caught in his throat as he took a step toward the curtain, his movements hesitant but determined. The economy passengers behind him murmured, confused. One man hissed, "Sit down, kid." "This isn't for you." Another shook his head, eyes fixed on Damien's lifeless form, and muttered, "Maybe someone else will help." Malik clenched his fists, fighting the rising tide of fear that threatened to drag him back into his seat. On the other side of the curtain, Elias Cray, Damien's loyal assistant, clutched the armrest, his face ashen, his body frozen between action and despair. He leaned close to Damien's ear, whispering his name over and over, as if calling him back by force of loyalty alone. His eyes darted wildly across the cabin, searching for salvation in faces that only reflected his terror. Malik took another step, his backpack still dangling from one shoulder, the weight of its straps pulling him back like chains. His throat was dry, his palms damp, but his mind was clear. He had no stethoscope, no training, no wealth to buy time, but he had memory, courage, and a refusal to sit idle. The steward's voice, broken with desperation, cut through again. "Somebody, please." Malik inhaled deeply, his young chest rising with the courage he had never known he possessed. He pushed through the curtain, his worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, every eye turning to him. For a heartbeat, the cabin froze. The rich, the poor, the crew, all united in disbelief at the sight of a boy stepping forward. Inside his head, doubt screamed, but louder still was the voice that had guided him since the sidewalk in Glenford. His eyes locked on Damien's pale face, and his trembling hands curled into fists before loosening again, ready to act. His pulse thundered in his ears, but his thoughts were sharp, singular, unstoppable. The boy's lips parted, his whisper swallowed by the silence but ringing like a vow in his own chest. "Do something." And in that moment, Malik knew. He would not turn back. He could not turn back. The life of a man who had everything now balanced on the courage of a boy who had nothing. A boy who had never owned a suit was about to step into a crisis fit for kings. Malik pushed past the curtain that separated economy from first class, his heart pounding so loud it drowned out the hum of the engines. The chief steward snapped, his voice sharp with authority. "Back to your seat, boy." "This is no place for you." But Malik didn't flinch. His voice cracked but carried urgency. "I know what to do." His words were met with scoffs and mutters from passengers who stared in disbelief, some shaking their heads, others whispering that the child had lost his mind. Yet Malik's determination burned brighter than their doubt. He remembered every detail of that medic's demonstration in his neighborhood, the angle of the head tilt, the rhythm of the compressions, the calm in chaos. Elias Cray, Damien's assistant, stood frozen beside the billionaire's slumped body. His usual polished confidence had vanished, replaced with trembling hands and eyes wide with helplessness. Sweat glistened on his brow, and when Malik stepped closer, Elias's lips parted, but no command came out. His fear had stripped him of control. Finally, with a frantic gesture, he allowed the boy through, not from belief, but from the terror of doing nothing. Malik dropped to his knees on the plush carpet, the softness mocking the severity of the moment. He placed his trembling fingers beneath Damien's jaw, searching desperately for breath. Nothing. His throat tightened, but he forced his mind to stay steady. He tilted Damien's head back, opened the man's airway, and placed his hands firmly on the billionaire's chest. 1, 2, 3, 4. Malik whispered under his breath, each number more than a count. It was a lifeline. Gasps erupted around them. A young boy with ragged shoes and calloused palms was pressing against the chest of a man whose fortune could rebuild entire cities. Some passengers leaned forward, their mouths agape, while others recoiled in disbelief, clutching their armrests as though witnessing something forbidden. The steward hesitated, his training telling him to intervene, yet his body frozen by the absurdity of the sight. Malik's arms ached quickly, but he pressed on, sweat beading on his forehead, dripping into his eyes. Every push felt like it might be the last, but he would not stop. He could not. He thought of the medic years ago, the way that man's hands moved with certainty, saving a stranger in front of a crowd. Malik's small voice echoed in his memory. I want to be like him someday. And now, fate had thrust that dream upon him far sooner than he ever imagined. Damien's lips were pale, his skin waxen under the dim cabin lights. For a long, unbearable moment, Malik feared he was too late. His chest tightened, a wave of hopelessness threatening to drown him. He pressed harder, forcing strength into his weary arms. Come on, he muttered through clenched teeth, his eyes locked on the unmoving man. Then, suddenly, Damien's body jerked beneath his hands, convulsing violently. A rasping gasp tore from the billionaire's throat, sharp and desperate, as though clawing its way back from the edge of silence. Malik flinched but didn't stop. He pressed again, steady, consistent, whispering numbers like a prayer. The faintest trace of color crept back into Damien's cheeks, fragile yet undeniable. His chest rose weakly, life clinging to him like a flickering flame refusing to die. The cabin stilled. Passengers who moments before had whispered in doubt now sat rigid in awe, their eyes fixed on the boy. Even the steward lowered his gaze, silenced by the evidence before him. Elias, once pale with dread, collapsed into the seat beside Damien, tears of disbelief forming in his eyes. His lips trembled, but no words could form. Malik continued, his own breath ragged, his arms quivering with exhaustion. Yet he pressed and pressed, guided not by wealth or reward, but by an unshakable resolve to keep this man alive. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, every second stretched by the uncertainty of whether the boy's strength would be enough. And then it was. Damien's breathing steadied, shallow but present, his chest rising in fragile rhythm. His eyelids fluttered, though he remained too weak to speak. Malik's body sagged with relief, though he refused to pull away, his hands hovering protectively as if guarding the fragile thread of life he had managed to hold together. The atmosphere shifted. No one spoke, no one dared move. The disbelief that weighed over the passengers was not just at the sight of a boy saving a man worth billions, but at the quiet truth that courage and knowledge had triumphed where wealth and power had failed. The irony was sharp, undeniable, and humbling. Malik wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his breath shallow, his chest burning from the effort. His gaze lingered on Damien's face, now tinged with life, and a strange calm settled over him. For the first time since the chaos began, he allowed himself to believe he had done enough. Around him, silence pressed heavy, like the weight of a storm paused before breaking. No applause, no shouts, just the quiet thrum of engines and the collective realization that something extraordinary had just taken place. And in that silence, the truth settled deep in every heart present. A life worth billions now rested in the steady hands of a boy who owned nothing. When Damien's breathing steadied, the cabin seemed to exhale with him. His chest rose in shallow, uneven waves, but there was life again where moments earlier only the threat of silence had lingered. His eyelids fluttered, heavy and reluctant, before his gaze settled on the boy crouched at his side. Malik's hands, trembling with fatigue, rested lightly against the billionaire's arm, as though he feared removing them might undo the fragile hold Damien had on life. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, filling the silence as every passenger leaned closer, drawn into the gravity of the moment. Damien's lips parted, his voice raw, scraped thin by pain and exhaustion. Yet beneath the weakness, a sharp edge cut through, a tone born of a man used to command, a man unaccustomed to pleading. "If you save me," he rasped, his hand reaching up with surprising strength to clutch Malik's wrist, "I'll give you everything, my entire fortune." The words rang out like a thunderclap in the confined cabin. Heads turned sharply, whispers surged like a current through the rows, and even the steady drone of the aircraft seemed to pause. Elias Cray, Damien's longtime assistant, fumbled his phone, nearly dropping it to the floor as his eyes widened. He had spent years beside the billionaire, hearing deals worth billions reduced to casual promises over dinner, but never had he heard his employer's fortune laid bare in desperation to a stranger. The chief steward stiffened, his mouth opening in protest before closing again. The other attendants exchanged nervous glances, uncertain whether to intervene or to step back from a scene that no training manual had ever prepared them for. Passengers craned their necks, murmuring questions laced with awe and disbelief. "Did he just say all his fortune?" one man whispered. "Is he delirious?" another muttered, clutching his armrest tightly. Malik's heart pounded, but not because of the offer. Sweat trickled down his temples, stinging his eyes, but his focus never wavered from the billionaire's face. He leaned closer, shaking his head firmly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing around them. "Just breathe, sir. Don't stop now," he said softly, as though the simple words could anchor Damien to the present. The billionaire's grip tightened on Malik's wrist, his eyes blazing with a strange clarity even in weakness. He seemed determined to have his vow heard, as though life itself depended on binding this promise to the air. But Malik pressed forward with chest compressions, counting quietly under his breath, refusing to allow his mind to wander to the weight of the fortune that had just been dangled before him. For Malik, this was not about riches. The memory of that volunteer medic years ago burned vividly in his mind, the hands that pressed against a stranger's chest, the steady rhythm that pulled a man back from the edge. That moment had planted the seed of his dream, the desire to become someone who saved lives, not someone who chased wealth. And now, here he was, living the very test he had once only imagined. The irony of it all rippled through the cabin, seen and felt by everyone who witnessed the exchange. A man whose empire spanned continents, who owned ships, factories, and towers of glass, now begged for survival with nothing left to offer but the promise of wealth. And a boy, his shoes worn thin and his shirt clinging damp to his back, ignored it all to keep the man alive. It was as though the universe had placed two lives on a scale, and for once, gold meant nothing. Elias's voice trembled as he finally broke the silence, leaning closer with desperation in his eyes. "Sir, you can't. This isn't the time for promises," he whispered hoarsely, though his protest sounded more like fear than reason. His fingers twisted together anxiously, betraying his panic at hearing secrets that could shatter industries. Passengers hushed, sensing that they were witnessing something greater than an emergency. They were watching the cracks of humanity break through the walls of power. Malik continued his work, pressing rhythmically, whispering encouragements between breaths. He had no room in his mind for promises of fortune, yet he felt the weight of eyes boring into him, passengers wondering, judging, interpreting every movement through the lens of Damien's vow. His silence, his refusal to answer, seemed to them like strategy, like the careful patience of a boy who knew billions hung in the balance. The atmosphere thickened with unspoken suspicion. A businessman in the aisle seat shook his head slowly, whispering to his companion, "Mark my words, that kid's no fool." "He knows what he's doing." The companion frowned, replying, "Or maybe he just cares more than we expect." The debate swirled among them like smoke, feeding doubts and hope in equal measure. Damien coughed weakly, his eyes closing again as Malik steadied his breathing. The boy leaned in, his voice urgent but gentle. "Stay with me, sir. Keep breathing. Don't stop." His words were not commands, but pleas, carrying the weight of sincerity. Around them, silence fell once more, heavy and expectant, as if the entire cabin hung on each shallow breath that escaped Damien's lips. Malik refused to falter. He blocked out the murmurs, the stares, the disbelief, and even the promise that still echoed in his ears. For him, only one truth mattered in that moment. A man was alive because he chose to act. Yet, as Damien's vow lingered in the air, like thunder rolling beyond the horizon, Malik could not know that those words would outlast the moment, reshaping everything that followed. Irony wrapped the scene in invisible chains. The billionaire thought money could buy his survival, but the boy saving him wanted nothing but to keep a man alive. Still, the vow would not vanish. It hung heavy, a storm cloud waiting to break, its thunder promising consequences neither of them could yet imagine. The vow, made in desperation, would become the storm that followed them all. The flight crew scrambled to fetch the onboard medical kit. Their footsteps hurried and uneven as they collided with one another in the narrow aisle, but Malik remained steady at Damien's side. His small hands pressed against the man's chest with rhythmic determination, his lips counting softly, almost like a whispered prayer. 1, 2, 3. Breathe. The cabin, once filled with idle chatter and the clinking of glasses, now seemed to hold its breath with every beat Malik forced into the billionaire's faltering body. The boy's face glistened with sweat, but he refused to let fear show. His eyes never left Damien's face, pale and strained, as though life itself was slipping like sand between clenched fingers. Passengers leaned over the tops of their seats, some standing to catch a glimpse of the desperate scene. A billionaire, revered and untouchable in the world of commerce, was now clinging to life because of the steady hands of a 14-year-old boy who owned nothing. Gasps rippled through the rows with each rise and fall of Damien's chest, every breath a fragile victory. The air was thick with disbelief, a cocktail of awe, fear, and uncertainty. Elias Cray, Damien's loyal assistant, was usually the picture of composure, his sharp suits and colder-than-steel eyes giving him the appearance of someone who could never crack under pressure. Yet now, pacing in frantic circles near the aisle, his face was drained of color, his hands twisting together as he muttered incoherently, "This isn't happening. Not like this. Not here." His words broke in fragments, his voice unsteady as though the empire he had helped manage was collapsing before him. His glances darted toward Damien, then toward Malik, torn between disbelief and desperation. Above them, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are declaring an emergency diversion. Strong headwinds mean we will not reach the nearest landing zone for at least another hour. Please remain seated." The announcement was met with a collective groan and fearful murmurs, a cruel reminder that time was stretching mercilessly. An hour might as well have been eternity. Damien's eyelids flickered, his face twitching as he clawed back to consciousness. His lips trembled as he formed words, his voice hoarse like sand scraping against metal. "If you save me, everything. It's yours. My entire fortune." His fingers clutched weakly at Malik's wrist, nails pressing into the boy's skin with desperate force. The words reverberated through the silence of the cabin like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted again, louder this time, laced with shock and disbelief. Elias nearly stumbled backward, eyes wide, his mouth working soundlessly as though the promise itself had knocked the air from his lungs. Crew members exchanged wary glances, uncertain whether they had truly heard what was spoken. Passengers muttered to one another, their voices rising in a swell of astonishment and greed-tinged wonder. The richest man alive had just offered his entire fortune to a boy barely in his teens. Malik's forehead dripped with sweat, but he ignored the offer as though it were no more than background noise. His voice rose above the murmurs, steady and calm, carrying a weight that surprised even him. "I don't want your money. Just breathe." His eyes locked onto Damien's, fierce with determination, and for a moment silence fell again. His words struck deeper than any negotiation ever had for the billionaire. Yet in that fragile silence, a new voice emerged, sharp and cynical from the back rows. A passenger leaned forward, scoffing loud enough for others to hear. "He's just saying that to look good. Of course, he'll take the money when it's offered." The words sliced through the fragile calm, poisoning the air with doubt. Heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire, and suspicion took root where awe had once bloomed. Malik's chest tightened as he pressed on with the compressions, but the sting of the accusation seeped into him. His arms trembled not from exhaustion alone, but from the sudden weight of judgment pressing against him. He wanted nothing but to keep Damien alive, yet strangers now measured his every word against the lure of wealth. He could feel their eyes on him, some filled with admiration, others with suspicion, as though his poverty itself was evidence against him. Elias froze in place, his pale face turning toward the boy with hesitation, the seed of doubt flickering even in his loyal gaze. Malik's jaw clenched, but he refused to falter. He pressed harder, his voice rising again as he commanded Damien, "Breathe. Stay with me." His tone, fierce and unyielding, pushed back against the doubts swirling around him. Still, the damage was done. The boy was no longer just a savior in the eyes of the passengers, but also a figure of controversy, his sincerity questioned at every breath he fought to restore. The hum of the engines roared louder in Malik's ears, mingling with the whispers, the mutters, and the stares. He knew the battle he faced was no longer only against death itself, but against the corrosive suspicion of those who watched. Even as Damien's chest rose weakly once more under his hands, Malik felt the tension coil tighter, a storm forming in the space between truth and perception. The scene that unfolded was more than a rescue. It was a trial unfolding in the skies, where the boy's character stood as much on the line as the billionaire's fragile heartbeat. And though Malik had no desire for riches, the promise made in desperation had ensnared him in a struggle he had never sought. The test of saving a life was turning into the trial of defending his own character. Damien's lips moved faintly, his words slipping into the cabin like whispers carried by a ghost. His breathing had steadied, but his mind wandered far from the present. He muttered names, unfamiliar to most, but weighted with consequence. Keller, Zurich, Belize. His voice cracked, each word dropping like a stone in still water. Elias Cray leaned closer, his face drained of blood, the color gone from his cheeks as though he had seen death itself in those syllables. The assistant's hand trembled as he adjusted the blanket over Damien's chest, though his true motive was not comfort, but an instinctive attempt to muffle the words. Malik, kneeling at Damien's side, heard fragments too. He could not piece them together, but something in the tone told him these were not ordinary ramblings. They carried the sharp edge of hidden dealings, secrets not meant for daylight. He glanced around, and the passengers' faces confirmed his fear. Eyes darted, whispers slithered, and unease grew heavier with every confession that spilled from Damien's mouth. The boy pressed a steadying hand on the billionaire's arm, murmuring, "Stay calm, sir. Focus on breathing." His voice was soft, firm, yet the words could not stem the tide of revelations pouring from Damien's delirium. One passenger, a man in his 30s with sharp features and restless eyes, leaned forward from his seat in the business class. The glow of his phone lit his face as he angled the camera discreetly toward Damien. His thumb hovered above the screen, ready to capture history in motion. Malik saw the glint of the lens and reacted without hesitation. He reached out, pressing the phone down firmly against the armrest. "This isn't right," Malik said, his voice low but resolute. The man recoiled slightly, glaring at the boy with open disdain. "Kid," the man hissed, his voice dripping with scorn, "do you have any idea what this could mean? You could be rich just for holding this. People pay fortunes for less." His lips curled into a bitter smile, his eyes flicking toward Damien as if weighing the dying man's value against the boy's stubborn defiance. Malik shook his head, his expression calm but unwavering. His hands were still trembling from exhaustion, yet his conviction gave them strength. "He's sick," Malik replied. "This isn't a game. He doesn't even know what he's saying." The man's sneer deepened, his voice dropping lower as though he intended his words to cut sharper than any blade. "Or maybe you do know. Maybe that's why you're keeping him to yourself, guarding your prize, aren't you?" The accusation lingered in the air, heavier than the recycled oxygen filling the cabin. Nearby, passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, their eyes flicking between the boy and the phone, between the billionaire and the assistant who sat frozen in horror. Doubt had begun to spread, creeping like a shadow into the minds of those who only moments ago had watched Malik fight to save a life. Some leaned closer together, whispering suspicions behind cupped hands. Others stared openly, their faces unreadable masks of curiosity, envy, or quiet judgment. Elias finally spoke, his voice brittle as glass. "Put that phone away," he demanded, though his words carried more fear than authority. His gaze darted toward Malik, lingering there longer than necessary. In his silence, there was conflict. Gratitude for the boy's courage clashed with unease at the secrets slipping into the air. Malik kept his eyes steady, refusing to shrink under the weight of suspicion. He could feel it pressing in from every side, like the narrowing walls of a cage. He thought of the medic he had once seen years ago, the way that man had worked not for applause or payment, but simply because a life depended on him. Malik wanted to do the same, yet here, every choice seemed twisted into something ugly by those watching. He was not seen as a boy trying to save a man. He was being painted as a scavenger circling a fortune. Damien's murmurs grew louder for a moment, his head rolling weakly on the seat cushion. "Funds, accounts, hide it, they'll never find." His words blurred into nonsense, yet the weight of implication was enough to stir more whispers. Malik pressed a hand gently against Damien's shoulder, urging him to quiet. "Please," he whispered, "don't push yourself. Just breathe." But his plea only drew more eyes, more questions. "Look at him," another passenger muttered from across the aisle, his tone sharp. "He's protecting the old man's secrets." "No," another countered softly, though his voice lacked conviction. He's just a boy. And yet, the longer Malik knelt there, shielding Damien from probing stares and recording devices, the more tangled the perceptions became. He was a savior to some, a schemer to others. His silence, his refusal to exploit the billionaire's delirium, became both proof of his dignity and fuel for suspicion. The phone-wielding man finally leaned back with a scoff, slipping his device into his pocket but not before muttering one last venomous line. "You'll regret this, kid." "You just threw away a fortune." Malik did not answer. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, his focus anchored to Damien's frail frame and the rhythmic rise of his chest under trembling hands. Yet inside, doubt clawed at him. Not doubt in his actions, but in the weight of perception, the way truth could be twisted so easily when greed hovered in the air. The cabin had become a battlefield without weapons, where trust was the prize and suspicion the enemy. Damien's every breath echoed with both salvation and danger, each pulse of his weakening heart a reminder of promises and secrets too great for a boy to carry. Around them, silence returned in waves, broken only by the drone of the engines and the occasional cough of turbulence. But it was no longer the silence of awe. It was the silence of division, of passengers caught between admiration and doubt, of a crew torn between discipline and disbelief. Malik could feel the weight of their eyes, and though his hands remained steady, his spirit braced itself for storms yet to come. Every beat of the billionaire's heart was buying the boy enemies as well as gratitude. Suddenly, Damien's breathing faltered again, the sound of it breaking into shallow, irregular gasps that sent a chill through the cabin. The monitors in the emergency kit flickered, warning lights pulsing in red, but the defibrillator refused to charge. A steward frantically slapped the machine's side, his face paling as the silence of failure confirmed their worst fear. "We're losing him," he cried, his voice cracking under the weight of helplessness. Panic erupted like a wave, passengers rising from their seats, voices overlapping in confusion and fear. The once-ordered cabin now throbbed with chaos, the air heavy with dread. Amid the noise, Malik forced himself to block it all out. His heart pounded in his chest, but his focus sharpened. He could not let Damien go. He dropped his small hands firmly against the billionaire's sternum, pressing hard, then releasing, then pressing again in steady rhythm. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, but he did not falter. His arms trembled with exhaustion, the ache in his muscles screaming for him to stop, yet he pushed through, recalling the image burned into his memory. The medic years ago, kneeling in a crowded community hall, his hands steady as he gave a stranger a second chance at life. Malik whispered the medic's rhythm in his mind, syncing his breath to the count. The steward's panicked shouts faded into the background as Malik's voice rose, stronger than the fear inside him. "Stay with me," he commanded, his tone fierce and unwavering, though he was only a boy among men. Passengers froze, their eyes drawn to the sight of a teenager defying despair with nothing but his will. Then, against every odd, Damien's chest heaved. A violent gasp tore from his lips, his body jerking as though dragged back from the edge of death. Relief exploded across the cabin. Gasps, tears, and even applause broke through the tension. A few passengers covered their mouths, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Elias Cray, Damien's assistant, sagged into his seat, his hands trembling as if the strength had drained from him all at once. The billionaire's shallow but steady breaths seemed like a miracle stitched together by the boy's resolve. But just as the wave of relief began to settle, a new sound cut through the cabin, harsh and venomous. A man in business class stood abruptly, his seat back snapping upright. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features set in a scowl that radiated hostility. His name, murmured among those who knew him, was Rourke. He thrust an accusing finger toward Malik, his voice rising above the hush of the crowd. "Don't you see what's happening?" he shouted, his words sharp as a blade. "This boy is faking the crisis. He wants the old man's money. He's playing all of you." The cabin rippled with shock. Passengers turned their heads, caught between relief and suspicion, their eyes darting from Rourke's furious glare to Malik's exhausted frame. Malik froze, his hands hovering above Damien's chest as the weight of the accusation crashed down on him. His face flushed with heat, his chest tight, but he managed to shake his head weakly. "I only wanted to help," he whispered, his voice hoarse from strain. Rourke sneered, stepping forward as if daring anyone to challenge him. His fists clenched at his sides, his stance radiating menace. "Look at him. A poor boy with nothing. Do you really believe he doesn't want the fortune that was promised?" His words dripped with venom, and the tension in the cabin thickened, feeding on doubt. Passengers whispered furiously among themselves, their earlier awe shifting into suspicion. Elias's eyes flickered, uncertainty clawing at him despite what he had witnessed. His loyalty to Damien battled with the sharp edge of fear planted by Rourke's words. One passenger muttered loudly, "Maybe he is taking advantage." Another snapped back, "Didn't you see? He saved the man." But doubt, once sown, spread quickly. The relief that had filled the air moments before now gave way to unease, mistrust seeping like smoke through the cabin. Malik's body trembled, not just from fatigue but from the crushing weight of injustice. His mind screamed at him to defend himself, but his chest burned with exhaustion, his throat raw from shouting life into Damien only moments before. He looked at the passengers' faces, some filled with admiration, others clouded with doubt, and realized that truth was no longer enough. No matter what he said, some would always see him as a boy chasing wealth rather than a life. Damien, still unconscious, could not speak for him. Elias's silence cut deep, his indecision stinging like betrayal. Malik's breath came ragged, but his heart held firm. He had acted out of instinct, out of the same dream that had fueled him for years, the dream to heal, not to gain. Yet the crowd could not see the boy's soul. They only saw circumstance, and circumstance was easy to twist. Rourke's glare lingered, his lips curling into a cruel smile as he surveyed the uncertainty his accusation had spread. The passengers' whispers grew louder, a storm of divided opinions, some praising Malik's bravery, others questioning his motives. Malik lowered his head, his hands still resting lightly against Damien's chest, and whispered again, more to himself than to anyone else, "I only wanted to help." But suspicion spread like smoke, curling into every corner of the cabin, unseen yet choking. For Malik, the fight to keep Damien alive had been the hardest battle of his young life. Yet in that moment, he realized a bitter truth. Saving a life was hard, but saving trust was proving harder. The billionaire whispered, "If you save me, I'll give you my fortune." But the boy only smiled. He wasn't after money, only to help. If you believe compassion is more valuable than gold, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Rourke's outburst escalated with violent speed as he lunged forward, his chair scraping against the cabin floor with a harsh screech that drew startled gasps from nearby passengers. His hand shot out, fingers curled like claws, aiming to shove Malik away from Damien's weakened body. The boy barely had time to react. His heart jolted, eyes widening as the man's shadow fell over him. The suddenness of the attack shattered the fragile calm that had lingered in the cabin after Damien's collapse. Crew members sprang into action, rushing from the aisles to intercept Rourke, their uniforms flaring in the narrow space as they grabbed at his arms. The struggle was clumsy, desperate, bodies colliding in the tight quarters. "He's lying," Rourke spat, his voice raw with accusation as they restrained him. His words, loud and bitter, cut across the cabin like a blade, sharper than any physical strike could have been. Passengers who had been holding their breath now erupted in whispers, their faces turned toward the scene, eyes darting between the furious man and the boy still kneeling by Damien. Some expressions carried sympathy, but many others were clouded with suspicion, fed by Rourke's venom. The atmosphere shifted palpably, the weight of doubt settling over every row. Elias Cray, usually composed and loyal to his employer, stood trembling at Damien's side. His lips tightened and sweat gathered along his brow as his eyes flicked between the billionaire's labored breaths and the boy who refused to leave his side. "Tell me the truth," Elias demanded, his voice breaking, louder than he intended. His hands clenched into fists as he leaned toward Malik, his face pale and drawn. "Are you after his fortune?" The words, spoken aloud, crystallized the fears that had begun to bloom among the passengers. Gasps and murmurs followed, the air thick with suspicion. Malik froze, his chest tightening as though an invisible rope had wrapped around him. His dark eyes flickered with disbelief, hurt cutting deeper than exhaustion ever could. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his throat felt dry, his words caught somewhere between innocence and despair. He had never thought of riches, not when he saw Damien collapse, not when his hands pressed against the man's chest in desperate rhythm. His only thought had been survival, keeping another man alive, regardless of who he was. Yet, to the watching eyes, Malik was not simply a boy. He was poor, ragged, and desperate-looking. In their minds, his motives seemed written on his clothes, as if poverty itself was proof of greed. Damien stirred faintly on the seat, his lips parting, a rasp escaping his throat. His hand twitched weakly as though to reach out, but he lacked the strength. The faint wheeze of his breathing filled the silence between words. Then, with the weight of a man who once ruled empires, he forced his voice to rise. Enough. Let him be. The command was fragile, yet carried an authority that could not be ignored. His words settled over the crowd like a gavel striking wood. For a fleeting moment, silence reclaimed the cabin, passengers bowing their heads, the tension thick but hushed. Yet the damage had already been done. Malik lowered his head, the sting of betrayal searing through him like fire. He had not come for wealth. He had not asked for promises or riches. All he wanted was to keep a man alive, to prove that life, any life, was worth fighting for. But the eyes on him no longer reflected trust. Some still saw the boy who fought for breath, but many more now saw shadows where none existed, motives where none belonged. Whispers persisted in the background, some muttered in pity, others in doubt. Malik's thoughts raced. Why did helping feel like a crime? Why did saving a life mean defending his own truth? His arms ached from compressions, his chest burned with fatigue, and now his spirit bore the weight of judgment he had never asked to carry. Around him, the hum of the engines felt colder, harsher, the metal walls closing in as though the entire sky had turned against him. He swallowed hard, forcing his eyes back to Damien, grounding himself in the only reason he had ever acted. Above them, the cabin lights flickered faintly, a reminder of turbulence yet to come, a warning that the storm outside mirrored the storm within. Malik clenched his fists, determined not to let go, even as doubt pressed in on all sides. The murmurs of strangers cut him deeper than the ache in his bones, but he resolved to hold his ground, even if every eye turned against him. In the middle of the sky, a boy's truth was being buried beneath other people's doubts. The plane jolted violently, as if the sky itself had thrown the aircraft into a furious storm. Glasses toppled from tray tables, ice scattered across the carpet, and passengers clutched their armrests in fear. Above the roar of the engines, a chorus of gasps echoed when Damien Vaylor's body convulsed in his seat. His chest heaved once, twice, then stilled in a terrifying rhythm that signaled his heart was giving up once again. The billionaire's face turned a ghastly shade of gray, and his lips parted as though his breath had been stolen away by the turbulence. "Make space," Malik shouted, his young voice cutting through the chaos. His hands trembled, but his resolve was firm. He shoved a tray aside and leaned over Damien, planting his palms on the man's chest with all the strength his 14-year-old body could muster. He pressed down hard, the sound of bones shifting under his weight a grim reminder of the stakes. The boy counted aloud, each word an anchor against the rising tide of panic. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe. For a moment, the cabin froze around him. The wealthy passengers, many of them used to watching others do the work of saving, stood motionless. The crew hovered, their training faltering under the crushing weight of this particular emergency. But then, in a moment no one expected, Elias Cray, Damien's assistant, usually composed and untouchable in his tailored suits, collapsed to his knees beside Malik. His face was pale, streaked with sweat, his hands shaking violently. "Tell me what to do," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, just tell me." Malik glanced at him, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. "Follow my count," he said firmly, his voice carrying an authority beyond his years. "When I press, you press. When I stop, you breathe." Elias nodded frantically, his usual calm shattered, but desperation made him obedient. Together they moved, a strange rhythm born of necessity, wealth and poverty bound together by the fragile thread of a dying heartbeat. The billionaire's body jerked with each compression, his suit wrinkling under the force of their hands. Sweat poured from Malik's brow, dripping onto Damien's shirt. Elias's breathing grew ragged, his lips mouthing the count Malik gave him as though each number was a lifeline. Around them, passengers leaned forward in their seats, their faces a blend of fear and awe. Some whispered prayers, others recorded with trembling hands, their phones shaking as much as their faith. "Come on, breathe," Malik cried, his voice cracking as his arms grew heavy. His chest burned, his muscles screamed, but he refused to stop. He could not let this man slip away, not while he still had strength in his body. Elias faltered once, his hands pressing too lightly, but Malik snapped at him, his voice sharp. "Harder! Don't stop now!" Elias obeyed, his jaw clenched tight as if grinding the fear into grit. Time blurred into a nightmare. Seconds stretched like hours, the cabin filled only with the rhythm of compressions and the distant hum of engines fighting against the storm. Malik's vision wavered at the edges, black spots clouding his eyes, but he forced himself to stay focused. He thought of his father working late shifts, of his neighbors who had once looked at him with pride when he helped carry groceries. He thought of the medic he once admired, the man whose calm hands had saved a life on a broken street corner. That memory kept him moving, even as exhaustion threatened to drag him down. And then, with a sudden violent gasp, Damien's chest rose. His body jolted as though shocked by some unseen power. The sound of air filling his lungs was louder than the roar of the engines. The passengers erupted, some weeping openly, others cheering with relief. A steward dropped to his knees in gratitude, whispering, "He's back. He's alive." Malik fell backward onto the carpet, his arms limp, his body trembling like a leaf in the wind. His chest heaved with exhaustion, sweat soaking his thin shirt. Elias sat frozen, his hands still pressed against the billionaire's chest, staring as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. Damien's eyelids fluttered. His eyes, glassy but awake, fixed on Malik with surprising clarity. Slowly, with the last of his fading strength, he reached out a trembling hand and gripped the boy's wrist. His voice was hoarse, every word dragged from the depths of pain, yet his tone was unmistakably sincere. "You chose to help, even when the world doubted. That is worth more than gold." Malik's eyes widened, his lips parting in disbelief. The boy did not see the fortune behind those words, nor the empire Damien controlled. He saw only the sincerity, the raw truth in the gaze of a man who had once believed money could solve every problem. For the first time, the billionaire discovered something his empire could never purchase. The plane struck the runway with a bone-rattling jolt, the cabin vibrating as the wheels fought against the tarmac. A loud screech followed, then the sudden roar of reverse thrust pulling the aircraft to a stop. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each second, until the flashing red and blue lights outside the windows painted streaks across the faces of weary passengers. The air inside was tense, heavy with the weight of everything that had unfolded mid-flight. Malik Dorsey sat hunched in his seat, his small frame trembling, his arms stiff and aching from the relentless compressions he had performed. His shirt clung to him with sweat, and his breaths came shallow, but he forced himself to sit upright, eyes fixed on the narrow aisle that now swarmed with urgency. Medics stormed aboard within moments, their boots striking against the cabin floor with precision and speed. They carried stretchers, oxygen tanks, and bags filled with instruments Malik could not name. The lead medic crouched beside Damien Vaylor, strapping an oxygen mask over the billionaire's pale face while others slid wires and clamps onto his chest. Beeping monitors filled the air, a rhythm that reminded Malik of how fragile the man's survival was. Elias Cray, Damien's ever-loyal assistant, followed close behind, wringing his hands and muttering to himself. He glanced back at Malik briefly, his expression sharp yet conflicted, as though torn between gratitude and suspicion. His lips parted as if to speak, but the words died before they reached the boy. Passengers began to shuffle out, their voices hushed but cutting all the same. "That boy saved him," one whispered, a note of awe carrying through the crowded aisle. Another voice countered, sharp with doubt. "No, he just wanted money. Didn't you hear what Vaylor promised him?" The murmur spread like a storm, each fragment of gossip twisting into another version of the truth. Malik's chest tightened. His hands, still shaking, clutched at the worn straps of his backpack as if holding on to the last piece of who he was before this flight. He wanted to vanish into the background, to become invisible again, but every eye seemed to find him. A firm hand landed on his shoulder. One of the airport officials, a tall man in a Navy uniform, leaned down. "You need to come with us, son," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. Malik swallowed hard and nodded. His legs wobbled as he stood, every muscle in his body screaming from exhaustion, yet his resolve carried him forward. The narrow aisle felt like a gauntlet, passengers' eyes following him with a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and thinly veiled suspicion. A camera flash from outside the window lit the cabin for a brief second, signaling the chaos that awaited him beyond the door. The ramp down from the aircraft was lined with medics and reporters, their equipment forming a wall of urgency and questions. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts, Voices shouted over one another and microphones were shoved forward like spears. Malik flinched at the flashes, his eyes watering under the assault of lights. "How did you save him?" one reporter yelled. "Did Damien really promise you his fortune?" another demanded, her voice sharp and hungry for scandal. Malik shook his head, his words nearly lost in the storm. "I just wanted to help," he whispered, then repeated louder, "I just wanted to help." But no one seemed to hear the sincerity, only the headlines they could twist from his simple truth. Elias emerged from the crowd, trailing the stretcher as Damien was loaded into the ambulance. His expression remained unreadable, part gratitude for the boy's actions, part suspicion born from the whispers, and perhaps part awe that a child had stood where seasoned men had faltered. Malik searched his face for acknowledgement, for some confirmation that what he had done was enough, but Elias turned away sharply, following his employer as the ambulance doors slammed shut. Malik stood there under the floodlights, his heart pounding louder than the sirens. Airport officials tried to shield him, guiding him toward a quieter exit. But the press pressed harder, questions slicing through the night. His voice cracked as he repeated himself again, desperately clinging to the truth. "I just wanted to help." The words fell flat, drowned out by the noise of the world that always seemed too eager to doubt. His tired eyes lifted toward the night sky, where planes glided silently in the distance, their trails vanishing into darkness. He realized then that the fight was no longer about saving a life, it was about holding on to the truth of why he acted. And as cameras continued to flash and voices swirled around him, Malik felt the weight of judgment settle like chains across his shoulders. The cabin had been a battlefield of life and death, but the world outside was no gentler. It was another trial, one he hadn't asked for, one he wasn't sure he could win. Yet even in the storm of disbelief, he clung to the same words that carried him through the sky. The world outside the cabin was just as turbulent as the skies they had flown through. Damien Vaylor's eyes snapped open, the sterile brightness of the hospital room cutting through the haze of his fading dreams. Tubes tethered him to blinking machines, their rhythmic beeps echoing against the polished marble walls. For a man who once commanded entire boardrooms with a glance, waking up under the watch of machines felt like a quiet humiliation. His throat was dry, and each breath dragged like sandpaper against his lungs. The first face he saw was Elias Cray, his assistant of 20 years, standing rigid at his side. Elias clutched a folder, lips pressed tight, as if ready to recite reports or shield his employer from the chaos waiting outside. But Damien's weak hand lifted, dismissing the papers before they could be offered. "Where is the boy?" Damien's voice was hoarse, broken, yet sharp enough to slice through the silence. Elias blinked, caught between disbelief and hesitation. His fingers twitched around the folder, knuckles whitening. "Sir, you've just come out of—" "I asked," Damien interrupted, each word strained but unrelenting. "Where is the boy?" His tone carried the same authority that once crushed corporate rivals, though now it trembled with fragility. Elias's chest rose and fell, torn between duty and unease. He glanced toward the door where two suited men stood guard, their hands folded in disciplined stillness. "Bringing him here could complicate matters," Elias murmured. "The press is circling, investors are restless, and the board is demanding." "Enough," Damien rasped, his pale hand cutting through the air with surprising force. The motion sent the heart monitor spiking, the room filling with rapid beeps. Elias flinched at the sound, torn between obeying his employer's command and protecting his fragile health. The billionaire's eyes narrowed, his breath shallow but unyielding. "Find him." Now, moments later, the heavy door creaked open. Malik Dorsey stepped inside hesitantly, his shoes scuffing against the pristine floor. The boy looked painfully out of place. Worn jeans, a frayed collar, and a backpack that sagged from overuse. His eyes darted around the gleaming walls and the silent men in black suits, his hands twisting nervously at his sides. For all the grandeur of the room, Malik seemed smaller, a boy thrown into a world not built for him. Damien studied him, his gaze steady, piercing. For years he had measured men by the sharpness of their ambition, the hunger in their eyes, the weight of their handshake. But Malik's presence carried none of those markers. Instead, there was a quiet steadiness, the kind of dignity that could not be purchased or staged. The billionaire's voice cracked, softer now. "I meant what I said," he whispered, his hand trembling as it reached slightly off the bed. "My fortune belongs to you." The air thickened instantly. Elias's eyes widened, color draining from his face as though an empire had slipped through his fingers into the hands of a stranger. The guards at the door stiffened, exchanging quick, uncertain glances. The monitors continued their relentless rhythm, but in that frozen moment, it was Damien's words that dictated the beat of the room. Malik swallowed hard, his chest tightening as he took a cautious step closer. His mind raced with the absurdity of the moment. How could a boy who once patched worn soles with tape be standing in front of the richest man alive, offered an empire as casually as one might offer a drink of water? His voice came steady despite the fear pressing against his ribs. "I don't want your fortune," Malik said, his eyes locked with Damien's. "I only wanted you to live." The words dropped heavy in the room, stripping away all the wealth, the guards, the polished marble. For the first time in decades, Damien Vaylor's composure cracked. His lips trembled, his chest shuddered with uneven breaths, and his vision blurred as tears welled unbidden. He had conquered markets, silenced competitors, and commanded nations' economies, but in that moment, he was just a man weeping in gratitude. Elias lowered his gaze, his throat tight, as though even he could not deny the truth before him. The empire he had helped maintain suddenly felt weightless compared to the boy's simple words. And Damien, overwhelmed, let the tears fall. The richest man alive had just been outbid by kindness. News spread rapidly. The moment the aircraft touched down and the story of the boy who saved a billionaire began to leak, the world reacted with the speed of wildfire. Within hours, headlines across major outlets carried Malik's face, sometimes a blurry photograph from a fellow passenger's phone, other times a hastily snapped image as he was escorted from the airport. Each headline spun its own tale. One called him a hero who had defied the odds. Another hinted at ambition, questioning whether a poor boy might have seen an opportunity to rise by attaching himself to the world's richest man. Talk shows dissected the incident, panelists arguing heatedly. Was it selfless courage, one anchor asked, or a carefully played chance? The truth became muddled in the noise, and Malik's name became a battlefield where strangers clashed over meaning. Malik, meanwhile, returned to the quiet streets of his neighborhood. The cracked sidewalks greeted him with the same uneven rhythm as before, lampposts flickering dimly in the dusk, casting tired shadows across familiar corners. No camera crews followed him here. The neighborhood boys he once tutored ran past with soccer balls, unaware of the firestorm raging beyond their streets. He walked slowly, shoulders heavy, as if the world's voices clung to him even after he had left the airport behind. The murmurs of strangers debating his motives on television echoed in his head, blending with the faint hum of distant traffic. He wanted only to disappear into the silence of home, to breathe without being judged. When he reached his doorstep, however, the expected silence was broken. A dark sedan sat parked along the curb, its polished frame out of place among rusting bicycles and broken mailboxes. Standing by the door was a man in a neat suit, tall and composed, holding a briefcase tucked tightly under one arm. The man's expression was unreadable, neither warm nor hostile, simply fixed with a calm professionalism. Malik froze, his hand tightening on the strap of his backpack. "Malik Dorsey?" the man asked, his voice smooth but formal. His eyes carried the weight of authority, though softened slightly when they met Malik's wary gaze. Malik nodded slowly, unsure if he should speak. The man adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and held out a sealed envelope. "I represent the Vaylor Foundation," he explained. The name alone made Malik's chest tighten. The billionaire's world had reached his doorstep faster than he could have imagined. "I was instructed to deliver this to you personally." "It bears, Mr." Vaylor's signature. With hesitant hands, Malik accepted the envelope. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if the words inside carried more than ink. He tore it open carefully, unfolding the thick parchment letter within. His eyes scanned the first lines, and the breath caught in his throat. It was Damien Vaylor's handwriting, sharp but slowed by recovery, every stroke deliberate. "You reminded me," the letter began, "that a man's worth is not in the towers he builds or the wealth he hoards, but in the breath of life itself. You gave me back mine." Malik read silently, his lips trembling as he tried to take in each sentence. The billionaire had not written of business, power, or empire. Instead, the words spoke of gratitude, of transformation. Midway down the page, the line struck like a thunderclap. Damien had created a scholarship trust in Malik's name, funds dedicated solely to ensuring that the boy could study medicine anywhere he chose in the world. Malik's vision blurred as he read the words again, disbelieving. He thought of the nights he had whispered dreams of becoming a doctor, of the afternoons spent carrying groceries to save coins for books, of the evenings he had sat in church halls imagining a door to the impossible. That door had just been forced open, not by chance, but by the life he had chosen to save. The man in the suit waited silently as Malik folded the letter back, clutching it tightly in both hands. "Mr. Valor asked me to deliver this with no condition," the representative said quietly. "It is not a gift of fortune, but a trust in your future." His eyes flickered with something almost human, a brief warmth that betrayed his professional mask. Then he added, "He insisted the choice is yours." No strings. Malik swallowed hard, words struggling to form. I didn't do it for this," he murmured. His voice was soft but resolute, echoing the conviction he had shown in the cabin high above the clouds. The representative nodded once. "That's why he chose to honor you this way." He stepped back toward the sedan, leaving Malik standing alone with the letter pressed to his chest. As the car pulled away, Malik leaned against the worn wood of his door, the letter trembling in his grip. The world beyond his neighborhood might still question him, twisting his story into endless debates of motive and ambition. But here, in his hands, was a truth unshakable. Damien Valor, the man whose name could command empires, had chosen to place his trust in a boy who owned nothing. Malik unfolded the letter one last time, reading again the line that carved itself into his memory with the permanence of stone. "You reminded me that life's value is not measured in net worth, but in breath and courage." And with that, the boy who wanted nothing was given exactly what he needed. Damien sat beneath the wide branches of the oak tree, the late afternoon sun filtering through the leaves and scattering broken patterns of light across the grass. His cane rested against his knee, a quiet symbol of how far he had fallen from the indomitable figure who once strode through boardrooms with unshakable command. He breathed deeply, the air crisp with the scent of pine drifting from the nearby hills, and for a rare moment his chest felt unburdened. A figure approached from the winding path, thin, tall for his age, his new uniform pressed through slightly loose at the shoulders. Malik carried his books close, as though they were treasures not to be dropped. His steps slowed when he reached the oak, a mixture of reverence and nervousness shaping his every movement. "You came," Damien said, his voice low but steady. He looked up at the boy with an intensity that could have unsettled even seasoned men, but in Malik's case, it softened into something almost paternal. The billionaire's eyes, once sharp and cold, now carried the quiet reflection of a man humbled by fragility. Malik nodded, shifting the strap of his satchel. "I wanted to see how you were doing," the boy replied, his tone respectful yet filled with sincerity. He settled on the bench beside Damien, the wood creaking faintly under the weight of two very different lives brought together by chance. Damien studied him for a long moment, the silence punctuated only by the rustle of leaves above. His fingers tapped the silver handle of his cane as if summoning courage for words he had never said before. Finally, he spoke, his voice edged with vulnerability. "I offered you everything," he confessed, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Every company, every coin, every empire I built, and yet you asked for nothing. Do you understand what that means?" His tone trembled with the gravity of a man who had always believed loyalty could be bought, respect purchased, and trust signed away in contracts. Malik listened quietly, his dark eyes steady on the older man's weathered face. He could see the weight Damien carried, not in his cane, but in the furrows of regret carved deep across his brow. "I didn't need your fortune," Malik said gently, his hands resting on his knees. His voice was calm, but his heart raced, aware of how powerful his words might be to someone who had spent his life believing otherwise. "I only wanted you to live." The billionaire turned sharply toward him, struck by the simplicity of the statement. His lips parted, but no reply came immediately. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant call of a bird echoing across the hills. Damien's chest rose with an unsteady breath, and for the first time in years, his throat tightened with the sting of unshed tears. He looked away, ashamed of the wetness clouding his eyes. The boy, noticing, did not draw attention to it. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his words carrying the wisdom of someone far older than his years. "You don't have to give me your fortune," Malik said softly. "Just promise me you'll use yours to help others breathe easier too." Damien's hand tightened around the handle of his cane. The plea pierced deeper than any demand for wealth ever could. He thought of the countless men he had defeated in business, the empires he had claimed, and the rivals he had buried under contracts and steel. None of it had asked him to breathe differently, to live differently. This boy, who owned nothing, had given him a task far greater than any boardroom could ever present: to change. He studied Malik again, and this time there was no distance between their worlds. The boy's posture was upright, his uniform crisp, but his eyes revealed honesty untainted by greed. Damien felt his own walls crumble, the pride that once armored him thinning into humility. He reached out, his trembling hand resting briefly on Malik's shoulder. His voice, stripped of all its former power, emerged quiet but resolute. "I will," he said. "I will use what I have to help others breathe easier. Because you showed me that life is worth more than any empire." The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of earth and grass as if nature itself bore witness to the vow. Malik smiled faintly, not in triumph but in quiet relief, his gaze meeting Damien's with the certainty of someone who had seen a life change before his very eyes. The boy had saved not only the man's heartbeat on a plane, but something deeper, the conscience he had long buried. Damien exhaled, his shoulders lowering as though a great burden had been lifted. He nodded, his voice soft, filled with gratitude. He realized that Malik had not only saved his life but also given him a purpose greater than wealth. The man who once believed he owned the world now understood he had been given something far rarer. The boy who had nothing gave the man who had everything a reason to change. Moments later, the billionaire's life was saved, and so was his heart. He took the boy under his wing, and years later, that same boy became a CEO. If you stand for hope, dignity, and transformation, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of humility, compassion, and integrity in the face of wealth and power. Its purpose is to raise awareness about the true value of character over money, provoke thought about human dignity beyond status, and inspire action toward kindness and selflessness in everyday life.